In a journal entry written when he was only 19, Stevens made a remarkable observation that presaged his future balancing of the worlds of work and poetry.
The mind cannot always live in a divine ether. The lark cannot always sing at heaven's gate. There must exist a place to spring from, a refuge from the heights, an anchorage of thought. Study gives this anchorage. Study ties you down. And it is the occasional willful release from this voluntary bond that gives the soul its occasional overpowering sense of lyric freedom and effort.
How does one explain Stevens' subject and elucidate his greatness as a poet? The answer is simple. His major achievement is the expression of the self in all its amplitude. In this respect, he writes in the grand tradition of romantic poetry. Ironically, his strategies of distancing, his use of odd characters, his opening philosophical gambits, his impersonal voice, serve to objectify and make authentic, deeply personal sources of feeling and thought. The true force of Stevens' poetry, what keeps drawing us back to his poems, to his words and images and metaphors and rhythms, is that he speaks to our vast and inarticulate interior world. Although his poems might have their sources in his personal reaction to the world, he once observed, poetry is a response to the daily necessity of getting the world right. They give voice to our own unique, personal, and otherwise formless inner life. Stevens touches our deepest and most private sense of self, and in doing so, we experience a feeling of personal fulfillment.
A professor emeritus at Clarkson University, John Serio served as editor of the Wallace Stevens Journal for 28 years. He also edited the Cambridge Companion to Wallace Stevens and Wallace Stevens Selected Poems. In the summer of 2015, he will publish a corrected edition of Wallace Stevens' collected poems. On October 2nd, 1879, Wallace Stevens was born in a 3-story brick townhouse in Reading, Pennsylvania. At that time, Reading was a thriving commercial center with a population of just over 43,000. Wallace Stevens' father, Garrett Barkalow Stevens, was one of the leading lawyers in Reading, Pennsylvania, and also had extensive business holdings. Wallace Stevens' mother had to start teaching school at a young age in order to help support her widowed mother and siblings. After teaching school for many years, she married Garrett when both were 28. Her gifts to Wallace of the writings of Emerson and Pope indicate an appreciation of literature. Wallace was the second of 3 sons born to the couple. 2 daughters completed the family. Wallace Stevens loved to sing and was, during one period, a choir boy in Christ Church in Reading. Wallace Stevens once described his father as quite a good egg, agreeable, active. And even in the journal entries from his early 20s that record some rebellious feelings towards his father, a deep affection is also evident. Garrett loved to read, and according to his son's memory, he used to delight in retiring to the room called the library on a Sunday afternoon to read a 500- or 600-page novel. During the last year of his life, Stevens wrote a poem called 2 Letters. The first section, called A Letter From, is filled with longing for the closeness of the family circle in which he had grown up.
2 letters. 1. A letter from. Even if there had been a crescent moon on every cloud tip over the heavens, drenching the evening with crystal's light, one would have wanted more, more, more. Some true interior to which to return, a home against one's self, a darkness, an ease in which to live a moment's life, the moment of life's love and fortune, free from everything else, free above all from thought. It would have been like lighting a candle, like leaning on the table, shading one's eyes, and hearing a tale one wanted intensely to hear, as if we were all seated together again, and one of us spoke, and all of us believed what we heard, and the light, though little, was enough.
Stevens enrolled at Harvard in the fall of 1897. Later in life, he said that his years there had been the happiest period of his life. During his years at Harvard, Stevens lived in a boarding house run by 3 daughters of a Harvard Law School professor. The other boarders, young faculty members and students, created an intellectually stimulating atmosphere. Stevens also found a congenial social group in this house. One resident wrote a letter home in which he said, "We had a beer and song night in this room last night, and a very sociable 2 hours we made of it." Stevens would have been a happy participant in such an evening because he played the guitar and enjoyed singing. While Stevens was at Harvard, his father wrote him frequent letters full of excellent advice and encouragement, saying that he was destined for great things, perhaps even a chair in literature. Stevens was an active member of the staff of the Harvard Advocate, which published many of his poems and stories. During his last semester at Harvard, he served as its president. One student on the staff described Stevens as a large, handsome, healthy, robust, amiable person with light, curly hair and the most friendly of smiles and dispositions. To keep up with his rolling, vigorous gait and animated, frank, and amusing talk, while striding alongside of him was both a feat and a privilege. He was modest, almost diffident, and very tolerant and kindly towards alike his colleagues and contributors of manuscripts. During his second year at Harvard, Stevens published in the Harvard Monthly a sonnet titled "Cathedrals Are Not Built Along the Sea," which was impressive enough that Professor George Santayana wrote a sonnet in reply. Stevens spent the summer before his last year at Harvard back in the Reading area. For almost a month, he stayed with a farmer named John Wiley and his 3 attractive daughters, who lived outside of Reading. Stevens apparently wanted to spend several weeks as close to nature as possible and away from Reading, which he described as lying at the bottom of a